Since March 17th is always the day on the calendar when we celebrate those who come from the land of Guinness, today is the exact right time to give the Irish kudos for their most famous edibles and drinkables. Irish coffee is pretty famous around the world, and I can concede that it's probably good. Don't know. Never had it. I do like Irish stew, and Irish whiskey is pretty good. The characters in The Informer enjoy some fish and chips. Come to think of it, I haven't had fish and chips in a long time, and now I want some. That's not true. I wrote this a few days ago. We had some last night, and it was pretty good. But while I can't honor their best stuff in Ireland, I must now promote something different. And it can be yours, if you're Canadian or American. And that, my bonny lasses, is Sparkplug Coffee. Yep, non-Mexican North Americans can get this premium quality coffee shipped right to their doors in a week or less, and Canadians won't be on the hook for the delivery charges. Sparkplug is so much cheaper and better than takeout. It's convenient and affordable, and it's also the best coffee you'll ever brew. Once you give it a try and maybe find your new favorite, you're gonna want to join the Autopilot Coffee Club. You can pause that membership for a while if you need to, or even just flat out cancel anytime. The website is sparkplug.coffee/HYES. Our promo code at the end there of HYES is the key to getting a one-time 20% discount. I don't know about you, but I'm thinking about fish and chips and maybe some coffee. So I better get started on this review so I can finish up and go get some. So, action! Have you ever seen The Informer? Top of the morning to ya, and sláinte, me boyos and girlos, and welcome to the 652nd episode that can be accessed on the spoiler-festooned podcasting channel. What we do is gaze at classic movies every Monday and every other Friday. I'm Ryan Ellis, your solo host on this March the 17th. The finest she-being in town, my wife Bev, would normally open her gob right now, but she's still recovering from her foot surgery and can't do the podcasting thing for a few more weeks yet. She was on the channel for our Oscars post-view, but we were in the bedroom so she could have her foot up. She has to do that for the sake of swelling and pain and such. That was a compromise. She should be back on the pod by either March 31st or April 7th. So happy St. Patrick's Day. I don't really care much about the tomfoolery that often goes hand in hand with this observance, and don't tend to do much to celebrate it, but I figured it made sense to find something Irish to cover in this slot. It's still Oscar month, so it had to be an Oscar winner, and there aren't that many Irish-related Academy Award winners left that we haven't already covered. The Quiet Man would be perfect, but we covered that a few years ago. Then TCM went and ran this little extravaganza in late February, and a light went off. I'm doing The Informer. Alright, so The Tattletale Heart was released nearly 90 years ago by RKO Radio Pictures in early May 1935, and the film was a pretty nice success for RKO. It's always hard to confirm money totals for movies this old, and it didn't seem to rank in the top 10 at the box office that year, but Wikipedia does say Mutiny on the Bounty was number 1. That was 1935's Best Picture winner, beating out this and Top Hat and 9 other films, 12 nominees in 1 year. Mutiny also made the AFI's list, so of course we covered it a long time ago. It was probably one of our first 10 or 12 movies, actually. Alright, so I'll give you the skinny on the plot now. John Ford directs a Dudley Nichols screenplay based on Liam O'Flaherty's 1925 novel. Victor McLaglen plays Jippo Nolan, a none-too-bright former member of the Irish Republican Army, who was kicked out of the group for not doing what he was told and murdering a British authority figure who had in turn killed a member of their IRA group. Now that he's jobless and times are tough, he's desperate for some scratch. In particular, he's got his heart set on taking his streetwalking girlfriend, Katie Madden, who's played by Margot Graham, to America to start a new life. When an IRA friend of his, Frankie McPhillip, who's Wallace Ford, that's the actor in this, comes out of hiding so he can visit his sister and mother for the first time in a while, Jippo takes advantage of the chance to win a bounty by squealing on Frankie to the Black and Tans. The Black and Tans were constables in the Royal Irish Constabulary who fought on the other side of Ireland's War of Independence. That's one thing I find fascinating about this story, by the way. It is a war movie, in a way, because these two sides are, well, at war, but we don't go on any battlefields. There are guns, but not that many. This is more of a street movie. And because it is, you get the gruesome fact that a guy dies in his own home with his mother having to watch it. Scorsese must have loved this one for all these reasons. He's always been interested in, say, street poop. I don't plan to swear in this, so you know what that word is actually going to be. Although I read online that they never actually say the initials IRA. Jippo is always calling it the organization, just like they're always calling the mob the outfit in the Mel Gibson movie Payback. In fact, if I watched this film and didn't know those details already, the specifics might have flown right over my head. Maybe it's not supposed to matter specifically who Jippo and Frankie worked for anyway. You just know they're outlaws and they can't go around telling everybody about it. I tangented off there of my own skinny, but back to that point. So here's back to the skinny. Jippo gets 20 pounds for telling them where Frankie is, so after his jolly good fellow is killed by the Tans, Jippo goes on a guilt-ridden bender. He blows most of that windfall in a matter of hours. Meantime, the local leader of the IRA, Dan Gallagher, played by Preston Foster, investigates who told the enemy where Frankie was, and it's only a matter of time before everybody discovers what Jippo did, and then makes him pay for it. Or, in a nutshell, village idiot blows all his money and ends up dying in church. One of those things I can accept happening to me. Take a guess which one. Really, I don't throw money around, but spending it on friends and hangers-on and showing them a good time isn't such a bad way to be irresponsible. But dying in church, especially after being shot, it's not even so much the dying or the bullets, it's the church. Although they do tend to have nice windows there. Stained glass. All right, the Rotten Tomatoes reviews of this movie are very good. 89% of critics like it, 17 out of 19 reviews are fresh, and the average is 8.3 out of 10. But only 77% of audiences give it a positive rating on the popcorn meter. Well, not only, but that is quite a bit lower, 12%. John Ford's filmography is beloved on the Rotten Tomatoes site, so it's no surprise that 89% is nowhere near his highest-ranked film. 4 movies that we have reviewed of his in the past, Stagecoach, The Grapes of Wrath, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and The Quiet Man, all outdo The Informer. This found its way into the National Film Registry in 2018. That was a big year for the registry as far as movies we've covered. They include Broadcast News, Brokeback Mountain, Cinderella, we reviewed that just in February, Hood, Jurassic Park, My Fair Lady, The Navigator, On the Town, I reviewed that just last year, Pick Up on South Street, Rebecca, that was reviewed just 2 weeks ago, and The Shining. So this is the 12th motion picture Congress inducted that year that's been discussed on this podcast. We're almost past the halfway point, because they always induct 25 a year. This is Oscar month, so of course this won some. 4, in fact. While it was nominated for Best Picture and George Hively's editing, it won trophies for John Ford as Best Director, his first of 4 wins in his career, Victor McLaglen as Best Actor, Dudley Nichols as Screenplay, and Max Steiner's Music Score. I think I'm saying McLaglen's name right, by the way. It's not LeGlocklin or LeGlaughlin or LeGlaglen, or maybe LeGlaglen? I'm not sure, but I think it's LeGlaglen. We know about George C. Scott for Patton and Marlon Brando for The Godfather, refusing to accept the gold when they won Oscars in the early 70s, but Dudley Nichols beat them to the punch by about 35 years when he said no thanks, long before they did. He wouldn't accept his Oscar because of a dispute between the Academy and a few different guilds about some union issues. It sounds like he accepted it several years later, at least. Maybe those disputes were resolved and then he was content to say, gimme, gimme, gimme. I was surprised to see that Admiral Ford, he used to like to be called Admiral, wasn't nominated for very many Oscars beyond the 4 times he won, only losing out for directing Stagecoach and for producing The Quiet Man. Didn't get nominated for The Searchers. One of the most famous films, most classic films he ever made. No nominations of any kind for that movie. His other wins, incidentally, were for directing The Grapes of Wrath, 5 years after this, How Green Is My Valley, the year after The Grapes of Wrath, and The Quiet Man. And the only time that he won one of those 4 gold naked guys in the year in which his movie also won Best Picture was what I would say was my least favorite of those, How Green Was My Valley. And that, by the way, is about the Welsh, not the Irish. When I was looking at movies, I thought, well, I guess I'll cover this finally, because I thought it was Irish. But it, of course, is set in Wales. I said that Mutiny on the Bounty won Best Picture over this, but that's all it won. It had 7 other nominations, but was shut out beyond the big prize. McLaglen beat out 3 different actors from Mutiny: Charles Laughton, Clark Gable, and Franchot Tone. I think that's right, Franchot Tone. That's his name. In fact, I think the 2 movies were nominated in the exact same categories. But Bounty had 3 actors in that category to this movie's 1. And as good as his direction was, I'm a little surprised that Ford won Best Director that year over Frank Lloyd, because Mutiny on the Bounty was so epic and would have been hard for Lloyd to shoot, especially all that location work and being on a boat for so much of the running time. I don't know if the schedule for Mutiny was long. It must have been for that movie. But Ford got in and out pretty quickly with The Informer. It was a quick shoot on the RKO lot, with them making it look like they're over in Ireland the whole time, not on a Hollywood backlot. But Ford was nothing if not efficient. That is, when he wasn't unavailable to work because he was on a bender, and sometimes had to have a backup director pick up filming. Like with Mr. Roberts, really good movie, but Joshua Logan and Mervyn LeRoy had to fill in for him at different times on Mr. Roberts. The American Film Institute wasn't in love with this film. They only nominated Max Steiner's composing for the top 25 music scores list. Okay, we know that Ford has done all those classics, and this hasn't stayed in everyone's consciousness the same way that Searchers and a lot of the other ones have. But those are some lovely credentials. Let's get going with the breakdown of each scene. Are you guilty yet? I feel a little guilty. It's a movie all about that. As it says off the top, this is a John Ford production, although he was not credited as the producer. Incidentally, this was back in the era when the directed by credit wasn't at the end of the opening credits. Maybe in some cases it was, but the Guild didn't mandate that just yet. In this case, Ford's credit came right after the main cast list, so then it shows who wrote it and who was the composer and who designed the costumes and so on. Before we meet any characters, a graphic quotes about how Judas threw the 30 pieces of silver that the Romans gave him for snitching on Jesus, threw at their feet. The Judy one ended up dead by suicide in the Bible story, but in the case of this movie, well, we'll find out about Jippo's fate soon enough. I did say it's spoiler-laden, so he's going to die. Although behaving the way he does in this film might be considered a form of suicide. I'll get to that at the end. So we're in a foggy Dublin in 1922, and our friend the galoot Jippo sees a poster advertising an offer of £20 for the head of his friend, Frankie McPhillip, who's wanted for murder. He's also in the IRA, or the organization. The Black and Tans are obviously desperate to find this guy because that's quite a haul in 1920s Ireland, especially when your pockets are as empty as Mr. Nolan's are, and probably a lot of other people's pockets in this area are just as empty. Maybe because John Ford worked in silent pictures long before the sound era started, there's no dialogue for a good long while, although we hear a singing busker who takes some grief from a military man. But the star McLaglen doesn't speak, and neither does anyone else really say anything until about the 5-minute mark, which is a long time for a 90-minute movie, to not have any dialogue. And it's Katie Madden who has the first lines. A guy comes onto her on the street, which Jippo sees, gets mad, and then cuts into her business by assaulting the guy, leading the lovers to get into an argument. She's mad at him because he doesn't have any kind of money for them to sail to America so they can get a fresh start. It's funny to think that the States was their refuge that offered them such hope, because the Irish were far from welcome there back in the Civil War era. That's what Gangs of New York is all about. And yeah, a generation or two had come and gone by 1922, but those memories don't just go away. I'm sure New York didn't pull a 180 and start welcoming the Irish with glee only about 60 years later. I know it's a big Irish place now, or Boston more so, but I don't know when that happened. It probably wasn't quite this soon. Of course, Jippo and Katie are white, so that sure helps. Frankie shows up at Dunboy House to say hi to Jippo, who is trying to enjoy a meal, Frankie. McPhillip has been hiding from those pesky B&Ts for months, and he's tired of it. Plus, he's desperate to go see his family, and he's taking advantage of the thick fog to skulk around and not be noticed. Of course, he's currently inside a restaurant where he can be noticed pretty easily, and all Jippo can see is the £20 reward on that poster. Literally. He visualizes it while Frankie's talking. It was somewhere in this scene, incidentally, that I turned on the subtitles and left them on for the rest of the movie. I was having a hard time understanding what they were saying with those thick Irish accents. Plus, the soundtrack's pretty old, so I wouldn't expect it to be crystal clear in the first place. I know a lot of younger people tend to do this all the time, or obviously if you have hearing problems you do anyway, but I find running the English subtitles in English language movies to be distracting, but it was a huge help in this case. So anyway, the G tells the F that he's no longer a member in good standing with the organization because he just couldn't grease that guy in cold blood that he was supposed to kill. After Frankie heads out to go see his mama, Jippo walks around town and feels tormented about this driving need to rat to the Tans about where the franker is. But then he just does it. Gots to get paid. The young McPhillip does make it to his mother's house and gets a kissy welcome from her and from his sister Mary. Heather Angel and Una O'Connor play Sister Mary and their Mamma Mia. But the Tans show up before he can even get a bite of food into his mouth. They use the butts of their guns to smash right through the front door, and even though he takes a few of them out in a hail of gunfire, they outnumber him and blow him away. It's not a graphic death, and I don't believe we even get a hint of blood, the code and all, but this sequence is vivid all the same. And for his mother to have to see that, yee. I don't think Mary did, but Mom definitely did. Oh, and I shouldn't forget a key point right before the Black and Tans started knocking, is that he told the ladies that the only person he ran into on the way over was Jippo, who's ashamed, but takes his 20 pounds of blood money out of the police station and is immediately haunted by that poster he saw earlier. He imagines it even though there isn't actually a poster right there. It's the beating of the hideous heart! In poster form. Or so it would seem. He tries to drown his sorrows in delicious whiskey, something he normally can't afford, but now he's got the bucks for an entire bottle. He says to himself while pounding one back that he needs to have a plan. Meaning, I assume, don't go wasting all this money on getting blasted. But then he hears Frankie's voice in his head saying he's lost. Previously on Lost. So I guess the whole having a plan thing is out the window then. Katie shows up and wonders how he can afford to buy liquor after not having a pot to pee in just an hour earlier, but he claims he beat up some American guy and I guess stole his money? Hang on, that's not so much better than what he did do. Katie gets to call him the name of the movie, he's the informer, and that makes him mad. She's right without even knowing it yet, but he can't handle the truth. You can't handle the truth. Son, we live in a world that has walls, and I'm going to rat on that too. Back on the street, he sees an old blind man standing on the curb. He had seen him before, too, and the man seemed shell-shocked or brain-damaged or something beyond having no vision. I assume Jip Jip is wondering if this is what he will become, handicapped, confused, and alone. Nope, that's not going to happen to you. Irish wakes always have lovely songs, and Frankie's does too. Although, isn't this the same night? The whole movie seems to be set in one night. They organized a wake already? Well, Jippo should very much avoid this place, but his guilt tells him to go to the scene of the crime and tell Mrs. McPhillip that he's sorry for her loss, blowing his cover when the change he got from buying that whiskey falls out of his pocket. Everybody stops what they're doing when that happens, although it's not like it'd be that shocking for this poor man to have just a little bit of money, just change like that. Since John Ford so often plays with reality by having McLaglen see the wanted poster in places that it isn't, maybe this is supposed to be that Jippo feels like everybody's staring at him suspiciously, even when they're not. Jippo picks the coins back up and says he told Frankie not to go home, but all the guys there agree that no one suspects him of being a rat. I guess his behavior isn't all that suspicious beyond the change thing, and maybe that was an imagination on his part. His friend is dead, and you could say he's just in shock, and if he wasn't involved, he'd have a right to feel that way. Plus, he's a little drunk. Jippo cries to the mama that he's sorry for her loss and that she's been very good to him, then drops some money in front of her and leaves. His IRA chums had kicked him out of the group because he disobeyed orders, but they let him into their lair so he can be part of them burning up the Frankie Wanted poster. I guess this is their own way of saying goodbye. Dan Gallagher and the guys insist they have to find the informer, and he needs to help them, even though those guys don't seem to suspect him of being a rat any more than those at the wake did. Well, Dan doesn't anyway. Jippo is mad that they ever told him to vamoose at all, but he learns that they'll let him back into the organization if he can find the informant. There's a terrific movie, by the way. Soderbergh's The Informant. It's so funny, and it's one of Matt Damon's most underrated roles. An effective use of voiceover is so great, it's responsible for most of the laughs, actually, the voiceover that Damon has. It's his delusion. And Damon in that is like McLaglen in this. Not all that bright. Anyway, Jippo is smiling ear to ear and pouring some of their liquor down his throat. Celebrate good times, come on. When Dan presses him to say who it was that informed, our man lays it at the feet of a boyo named Peter Mulligan. He claims Mulligan had a grudge against Frankie, but the G-ster has to buy time to think of what that grudge actually is by sipping some more booze. 2 birds, 1 stone. You delay so you can think, and you get to enjoy another free drink. And you're lying about all this. But when he leaves after coming up with a reason why there was a grudge between McPhillip and Mulligan, which I didn't write down, I forget what he said, one of the underlings, Bartley, immediately insists that the snitch was Jippo himself. Dan doesn't believe the story about a grudge or that Jippo would sell out Frankie, saying he's just not that type of guy, and he didn't have a motive. Well, that 20-pound reward is a great motive. Why do most people do anything? For money. And sex. Jippo gets right sauced and goes looking to fight a guy in the street who just happened to be looking at him. The guy says he's drunk and stupidly swats at our main man, who's just pretty blotto. But then Jippo punches him and a cop right out after the cop told him he was going to be arrested for hitting the guy. I guess it makes sense that none of the people surrounding this squabble seem too concerned about the cop who's laying in the street now. I guess since he's a British cop, these Irish folk would rather something like this happen more often, in fact. One of Jippo's friends, I guess it's Terry, the character played by J.M. Kerrigan. Well, in any case, the guy starts calling him King Jippo. So he's got 2 nicknames now because Jippo is in quotation marks in the credits, at least on Wikipedia. This big group heads into a fish and chips restaurant for, well, take a guess. Fish and chips. The man with a little less than 20 pounds in his pocket just wants to buy a meal for everyone. Keep the party going. What a changing character, too. He's exuberant and on top of the world now, not just drunk as a monkey. He's that too, but he's happy to be surrounded by so many fair-weather friends. And McLaglen plays a pretty decent drunk in this flick, pretty convincing. Playing it sauced is a good way to win an Oscar, in fact. Ray Milland did in The Lost Weekend and won an Oscar 10 years later. Nick Cage did it 60 years later in Leaving Las Vegas, won an Oscar. And while Meg Ryan in When a Man Loves a Woman and Sarah Silverman in I Smile Back didn't get major awards nominations for their drunken work in those, both of those films are among the finest things either actress ever did or has ever done. Anyway, some of the Jip's friends grab people out in the street so they can get some of this free grub too, but Bartley from the IRA refuses. He even nearly gets in a fight over it. Bartley is Joseph Sowers' role, and he is the one who said, when Jippo left the IRA meeting, that he was the one who informed to the Tans. Dan doesn't think so, but Bartley's sure of it. Terry nearly gets clocked by the big man for saying Katie will be fine walking the streets, implying that's what she always does, and it's in her nature, I guess. Once it appears Jippo's out of money, T-Dog is done with him. Only the apparently dumbest man in town pulls out his wad of cash to prove his friend wrong, which basically creates another witness to what he did. Because if anyone asks, Terry might very well tell them, he had a lot more than fish and chips money, and I saw it. They go to a high-class party where the G-Man enters Fantasyland again and pictures Katie in place of a woman he doesn't even know. Then he offers to buy a round for everyone in the house. Drinks are on the house. Everyone loves when somebody pays their way, so he's making friends, even after he grabs a cane and pounds it against the bar, which probably should scare everyone off. It feels like this guy could start swinging that thing at any time and at anybody at any second. And he does backhand a guy so hard that the dude collapses over a coffee table and doesn't get back up. McLaglen is as big as a horse, but they make him almost comically tough and strong on this film, especially in his last scene about the toughness. Then we find out why Dan is so motivated to find the rat who got Frankie whacked. He shows up at the McPhillip house and gets a big kiss from Mary, because these two are in love. Find my brother's killer. Or rat, I should say. She knows who the killers are. It's the Black and Tans. He says he wishes it was him and not her brother on the slab, but she says she'd die if it was him. Hell with my brother. Dan figures that he has to find out who the informer is and take care of him because that guy might rattle to the Tans on all of them. Dan claims he doesn't even care about his own hide. He's more worried about the organization and about Ireland as a whole. That's leadership, whether you like his politics or not, and his IRA-ness. Mary tells Dan here that Frankie name-dropped Jippo and definitely didn't say anything about Mulligan. So now Mr. Gallagher knows that Bartley was right about who ran his mouth to the other side. Back at the party where Jippo is with his boyo, there's more singing, which brings the big man to tears. So in this role, Victor gets to play a dumbass drunk, and he cries. All he needs beyond that are a physical disability and to die. Then he's sure to win an Oscar. And he did win, so I guess I'm not just being a wise guy here. It worked. Jippo gives £5 to that girl he pretended was Katie, so she has the cashola to go back to London. Sob story that he, I don't know what falls for, but he helps her out. That's generous, but talk about exposing yourself by flashing around all this money, because he pays the girl's bill at the inn too, which is another £4. Bartley overheard all this and has even more reason to suspect the guy. It's one thing to have money, but the bounty was £20, and how could this guy have this much money in his pocket any other way? Bartley and the other goons make Jippo go off with them, even though the landlady or the owner of the bar or whatever at this place is mad that no one paid for that last round of drinks. So it's on Terry to pay, who it suggested before the scene ends was about to be killed over it. Do I have that right? Geez, make him work it off or something. Don't just kill a fellow Irishman. You're at war. Kill a Tan instead. Jippo and the guys run into Katie, and he gives her what money he has left, although she seems to figure out how he could have gotten £20, or what's left of it, without him actually saying so. She does some pretty good face acting here to sell that. And she's horrified, watching as the IRA guys hustle him down the street in a way that sure isn't friendly. The IRA thugs toss him down the stairs into the basement of their lair, but he's so drunk, he just shrugs it off. It was a pretty good stunt the stuntman pulled off, going heels over head down those stairs. Not head over heels, heels over head. They sit him down, and everyone stares at him, leading him to accuse Mulligan, who they'd gathered up since he was accused by Jippo earlier that night. Isn't there an M-type thing here as well? Maybe Ford was paying homage to the movie M when they're all looking at him. Mulligan is played by Donald Meek, who was in You Can't Take It With You and Stagecoach in the ensuing years. I've covered both of those in the past, or we have. And he pleads in protest, explaining where he was all day. He couldn't have informed on Frankie, plus he's pro-IRA. Naturally, Jippo accuses him of lying, but Petey here gives him a detailed description of what he did that day. If he was the informer, that would be a well-thought-out cover story. Dan believes him, so he gives him some money for his trouble and gets a guy to drive him home. So now it's on Jippo, who has to talk about where he was all day and what he's been doing. Mary tells everyone about how Frankie casually mentioned that he met with Jippo at the Dunboy house. So, uh-oh. The Gypster blames everything on the alcohol, but Dan calculates that he spent all the £20 that night. And where did you get that money? Finally, Jippo just confesses, whimpering that he doesn't know why he did it, but he did it. One of the goons nearly puts a bullet in his ear right then and there, but Mary makes them stop from going to that length, and Dan agrees with her. They lock him up instead. But the reprieve won't last long because the IRA guys draw straws to see who will be the one to grease Jippo, which is an ironic twist because Jippo couldn't bring himself to do that before, and that's why he was so broke and desperate. The vicious circle. Dan must have just been placating Mary because she's not there, right? She wasn't there? When he tells his boyos that the man with loose lips might tell on all of them, so it's time to make him stop breathing. The one who draws the short straw doesn't want to do it, but he heads to where Jippo is locked up and pulls his gun. Only Nolan has escaped through a convenient hole in the roof. Guns start blazing, but Jippo punches a guy in the face and gets away. Dan mobilizes the troops, saying they're all done for if he gets away. Jippo again imagines he sees the Frankie Wanted poster on the wall and cries a little about seeing his dead friend's face this time. A lot of crying for him in the last half of this movie. He goes to Katie's and tries to convince her to go off with him, but she's appalled when he admits he informed on Frankie, saying, "May God have mercy on your soul." She holds him and rubs his head, though, admitting that she loves him. He even gets a kiss from this lady of the street. If he hadn't turned into such a pathetic liar, this would be a sweet scene. It's pretty sweet anyway. Katie goes to see Dan to beg for her man's life. She blames herself for putting the idea of escaping to the States into Jippo's head. Dan's problem is that he thinks the Tans will keep on using Jippo to get even more information out of him, though. Katie begs Mary, too, for Jippo's life, trying to get her to talk Dan down, I guess. But that doesn't help. And Danny G keeps saying he has no choice. He points out that Nolan confessed. So the matter is settled as far as the court was concerned, and the guys that want to kill him now. 3 of those IRA thugs heard Katie say that Jippo was at her place, so they head over there to put many holes in him. They blast their way in and start firing, but Jippo's so strong that he plows right through them and somehow avoids being shot. Or if they got him, he's no-selling it. Until he gets outside and Bartley is waiting, firing off something like 4 shots, and he does hit the big guy. This Nolan putz is so strong that he's able to stagger off to a church, although he falls over once he gets inside and is spotted by Mrs. McPhillip. She's in there praying, I guess, about her son. He confesses his radish leanings to her and asks for her forgiveness, which she does immediately because he didn't know what he was doing. Jippo isn't bleeding, probably the code, why they didn't show blood, and he doesn't look like he's seconds from dying, but he goes down to the floor out of camera range and does die, yelling for Frankie and saying that, "Your mother forgives me." But does Ghost Frankie forgive him for what he's done? I wonder. That McPhillip fellow seemed like a pretty good guy, but when somebody deliberately betrays you, that's a tough one to forgive, desperate for money or not. I like to lecture people the last couple of years that it's important to offer forgiveness to people if they're sincerely apologetic and want to make amends. So I guess I have to hope that their ghosts can get along. And what did I say about what you usually need to do to win an Oscar, or often have to do? It's a running joke, but it isn't untrue. And that's have a physical or mental disability, mental with him, he's dumb, cry, does that many times, and having a good death scene certainly helps too. Doesn't he have a crucifix Jesus type pose in his death scene? The Golden Oscar night was probably never in doubt with all those things, and he didn't throw that silver, or gold, down at the Roman's feet and then go hang himself like Judas did. He just did enough stupid things to get caught and killed, which in a way was its own suicide. Man's not smart, but maybe he knew somehow, I gotta stay and take the blame for this, face the music, without actually admitting it, and then of course he does admit it. I talked during the All the Kingsmen episode 10 days ago about how Robert Rawson ratted on people who he knew or suspected were or had been communists. Presumably it was hard for him to do that because he wouldn't do it when they first got on him about it, and then he was blacklisted by Hollywood. So then he did sell them out to get his career back. And here we go again with a similar to snitch or not to snitch premise. Although it isn't that big a choice for Jippo, is it? He does it pretty easily. Although he does feel bad about it immediately. And it's regular people being forced to hurt fellow regular people in these situations, the movie and in Rawson's real life, and other people that ratted on communists or maybe even not being communists, whatever. And it's the authorities who pit them against each other to do this. Like it's a cockfighting contest, and we're one of the chickens, and our closest friend is the other chicken. So the cast. Victor McLaglen, who was actually born in London, not Ireland, went on to be the antagonist and boxing opponent of John Wayne in The Quiet Man nearly 20 years later. Marquis of Queensberry. He got a supporting actor nomination for that, so he was 1 for 2 when gold was on the line in Irish-themed Ford flicks. He was in plenty of other John Wayne, John Ford films too, including something like 3 in a row in the late 40s. It's an interesting running theme that Ford has in visualizing things or people that aren't really there, even before he gets so drunk that night. This is a movie about guilt, and this guy is drenched in it. Although, while he's not bright, he's also not self-unaware. He knows he did a crappy thing to his friend the minute he does tell the Tans, and never does feel good about it. And I'll say that he earned that Oscar with a performance I didn't remember being as layered as it was when I first saw this a long time ago. As good as his work was, Ford treated him terribly to get it out of him. He got him legitimately drunk, treated him badly, and to say he kept him on his toes in general is a huge understatement. He even had him film the trial scene while hungover. McLaglen wasn't a fan of all this naturally, and was so mad that maybe Ford should have felt lucky he didn't get beat up for it. After all, Toothpick Vic was 6'3", and his hands were bigger than coffee tables. Margot Graham plays his Lady Katie. She was in another film that Dudley Nichols wrote that year, The Three Musketeers, then worked plenty for the next quarter of a century, although nothing much in her resume beyond those 2 films stood out to me. Preston Foster went from being Dan Gallagher here to one of the leads in a cool 50s crime film, Kansas City Confidential. Many people say that's one of the inspirations for Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs. Another movie I remember being pretty good was I Shot Jesse James, which he made with Sam Fuller about 15 years after The Informer came out. Heather Angel's career started only a few years before she played Mary McPhillip in this. She went on to be in Hitchcock's Suspicion and Lifeboat, then also was the voice of Mrs. Darling in Disney's Peter Pan in 1953. The Frankie character played by Wallace Ford here wasn't actually a Ford. His real name was Samuel Grundy, so no, he wasn't related to John Ford. I assumed he was his brother or something. I thought for sure he would be. Related or not, they did work together plenty of times. Beyond the Ford experience, he was one of the main players in Freaks a few years before this, and went on to be in Shadow of a Doubt and Harvey. All three of those podcasts are in our back catalog. J.M. Kerrigan plays Terry, the buddy Jippo hangs out with while he's having his drunken voyage around town. Right? I was never sure what that guy's name was. If someone said his name, I missed it. Kerrigan started in the silent era, then went on to be in Gone with the Wind a few years after this came out. Una O'Connor is Frankie's mom. She was in Bride of Frankenstein the same year as this, and The Adventures of Robin Hood 3 years later, two classics that we have reviewed. The director and the uncredited producer was John Ford. The Irishman had an incredible life and career, but he was also such a bully that if he were alive today and doing any of that and people heard about it, social media would crucify him. He wouldn't care, but they would crucify him. He was often a colossal prick, if all the stories are true, and I'm sure alcohol had something to do with that. He reportedly brought John Wayne to tears at least once, I think more than once, maybe partly because he was very mad that Duke didn't enlist after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and dragged America into World War II. Other actors stepped up to fight, like Jimmy Stewart, but John Wayne never did. So when I've called John Wayne a chicken hawk in past reviews, and when I did it in my All the King's Men episode a while back, that's why. He talked big about defending America's values and fighting for freedom, especially during the Red Scare era when people ended up losing their careers because they were blacklisted. But he never actually anteed up and did something when the chips were down. He'd just rather talk a big game. He'd make a great congressman if he were still alive today. Ford himself went over there, and shot war footage, risking his life to do it, from what I understand. I think Frank Capra and George Stevens did that too. They all had a lot of verve. Speaking of the war, I saw an interview with Maureen O'Hara earlier today where she said that she thought Ford was a very unhappy man because he was a film director, not a great military man. If she's right, then he must have had some self-hatred about missing his calling. Why didn't he just enlist then, if that's true? And even if he was terribly unhappy, he went on to be as good a director as there ever was. He's not my number one favorite, but just look at his body of work. You'll find talks about Stagecoach, The Grapes of Wrath, The Quiet Man, The Searchers, and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance in our archives. So this makes Ford Flick number 6 on this channel, and those are pretty indisputably all classics. I've always said that I think he's the guy that voters would rank number 1 if the AFI had ever compiled a greatest directors of all time list, like they should have. They never did do that. If Ford didn't finish number 1, it would be Hitchcock. I'm not saying that's what I would do. I just know the AFI well enough to figure out that's what they would do. Kubrick and Chaplin and Wilder and Wyler and Wells, and no doubt Spielberg and Scorsese would all be on that list too. The writer was Dudley Nichols. He went on to direct and produce some flicks in the 40s, but he was primarily a screenwriter throughout his career. He based his script on Liam O'Flaherty's 1925 novel. He had credits on Bringing Up Baby, Gunga Din, and John Ford's Stagecoach, all in the span of just a few years. And it's fitting that not only did he refuse to accept his Oscar because of that dispute with the Writers Guild and the Academy, but he was such a believer in his union that he was the president of the Screenwriters Guild for a year or two in the late 30s. Joseph August photographed this 1:3:7:1 black and white picture. The print that TCM aired was far from top-notch. They often show us great prints of old films on that channel, but this one is 90 years old, so slack can be cut. And I guess no one has bothered to remaster it. August's only Oscar nom was for Portrait of Jenny in the late 40s, which was his last film. He had died of a heart attack when he was only 57 years old, before Jenny even got released. So if he was at the ceremony to see if he won a trophy, it was as a ghost. The man also shot pictures like Sylvia Scarlett, Gunga Din, and a movie I covered late last year, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The editing was by George Hively, who also cut Bringing Up Baby. In addition to spending time in edit suites, he was a writer, although his writing career ended in 1927, which was when his editing career began. Feels like it's backwards to me. He'd edit first, then become a writer, but he was a writer, then an editor. Max Steiner, of course, composed the Oscar-winning music for this. He's one of the legends of doing that job, and he was rewarded with 3 Academy Awards in total. The other 2 were for Now Voyager and Since You Went Away. But this is the guy who came up with tunes for Gone with the Wind and Casablanca. He just didn't win gold trophies for either of those super classic films. Super classic, not just classic, but super duper classic. All in all, I got something out of seeing The Informer again. Ford did a solid to sometimes awesome job of shepherding all these Irish actors through some big crowd scenes, even if most of the movie takes place on indoor sets, the backlot, in fact, at RKO. In fact, it's a very confined movie, the polar opposite of Mutiny on the Bounty. But yeah, the cast is pretty good. It's a well-told tale of guilt and justice, and even forgiveness. If the mother and sister of the man who was wronged can let Jippo off the hook, maybe we can too. Little Terminator reference there for you. Terminator 2. I shouldn't neglect to mention that they made a film of this book before they made this one. There was a British version that came out in 1929, directed by a guy I don't know and starring no one I recognize. There was also a Joel Kinnaman, Rosamund Pike flick called The Informer that got released about 5 years ago, but it doesn't seem to be a remake or have any connection to this story. So in any case, that was how I saw The Informer. I'll promote what's coming up on Have You Ever Seen, and I'll let you know how to contact us in just a minute. But first, how about some movie trivia? I've got my typical 3 questions, and because it's Oscar month, there's an Oscar theme of sorts in the 3 of them. But don't get hung up on that, because it doesn't really affect the questions or answers. So question number 1. James Dean infamously died in a car accident. He made only 3 films in total, and how many of those did his character die, meaning have an on-screen death? Because we all die someday. Question number 2. Jurassic Park would more accurately be called which of these? Mesozoic Park, Cretaceous Park, or Triassic Park? And question number 3, name the actress who popularized the phrase, no pain, no gain. Did I say that right? Popularized? Okay, so what's coming up on this podcast? Well, on Friday, I'll be, of course, monologuing again. This time I'll be yapping about Paul Newman playing a boxer and Somebody Up There Likes Me. That didn't win Best Picture or Best Actor or anything, but it did win some technical awards, so close enough. It is an Oscar winner. As for next Monday, I'll still be talking on my own as Bev continues to recover from her heel surgery, and I'll be going on and on about Sidney Pollack's Out of Africa, a 7-time winner of gold on Oscar night. Rate this podcast in your app, but also write a review and subscribe. Do the subscribing thing on YouTube as well. Our channel is at HYES Ellis in the search bar on the tube. Comment and touch that like button as well. Email us. We're haveyoueverseenpodcast@gmail.com. On the media that is occasionally social, we're Ryan-Ellis and Bev Ellis on Blue Sky, and at MovieFiend51 and at Bev Ellis on Elon's Echo Chamber. And how about Sparkplug Coffee? Use our HYES promo code and get yourself a 20% discount. The website is sparkplug.coffee/HYES. All right then, before we tip a few beers and say goodbye on this St. Patty's Day, let's get to those trivia answers. Number 1, James Dean infamously died in a car accident. He made only 3 films in total, and how many of those did his character die? None. Jimmy never got to play, or overplay, I'm sure, a death scene. Question number 2, Jurassic Park would more accurately be called which of these? Mesozoic Park, Cretaceous Park, or Triassic Park? It is Cretaceous Park. Although you can't blame that one on Spielberg. Michael Crichton wrote the book, and he's the one that named the park. And question number 3, name the actress who popularized the phrase, no pain, no gain. It was Jane Fonda in her workout videos in the 80s. And the Oscar theme I talked about was that Jimmy Dean was a 2-time Oscar nominee, Jurassic Park won 3 technical trophies, and Jane Fonda went on to win twice in the 70s for Clute and for Coming Home. Okay, that, as they say, is that. Thanks for checking this one out, and happy St. Patrick's Day. Join me on Friday for Somebody Up There Likes Me, and again on Monday for Out of Africa. Meantime, I guess I'll pour a few drinks and think about how I really do have a little Irish in me. No lie, it's on my grandmother's side, my mom's mom. But I won't snitch on my buddy. The mental anguish is not worth it. Neither is being shot and killed. And cut.